Thank you so much for staying with us and watching Smart 24 TV. We do drive your business. Now, I'm still with Miss Lydia Buite, who is a programs officer at the Platform for Labor Action. We are talking about domestic work as a form of formal employment, something that hasn't been embraced by our culture and society here in Uganda and the globe at large. And we want to talk about the amendments in the Employment Act 2006 that have been brought on board, of course, in this year, that is in the month of July. That's to be specific, in this year 2022. But before we go into the amendments, Ms. Buite, we would like to talk about the rights of domestic workers currently under the current jurisdictions and the laws that we have in the constitutions. What rights does the domestic worker have?
Thank you. Having understood that right from the Constitution, the occupation of domestic work is actually not outlawed, it's work. So we have the Employment Act of 2006. Now, the Employment Act of 2006 has what we call a generic application. It does not mention different categories of workers that it applies to or employees. So it has a generic application. And because it has a generic application, it so means that the rights so enshrined in that act, they also apply to the right to the domestic work, because then the domestic work actually enters into a master-servant employment, or what we call contract of service or an employment contract. So some of the rights of the domestic worker do not actually differ from any other rights, apart from in a few instances which I'm going to highlight. Of course, the first right of a domestic worker is the right to be paid, because that is a cardinal right. The reason why we go to work is that we are paid. I work and I'm paid. So they have a right to be paid the agreed upon amounts and in the time frame. Or if you agree that I pay you after every day when you come to work, or I pay you after every 2 weeks, or I pay you at the end of the month, so you should be able to pay that agreed upon pay that you have agreed upon. Like, of course, you highlighted there is no minimum wage, so that becomes also a challenge in terms of how much they are paid. But at least that's the basic right of I should be paid. Now, when it comes to a domestic worker who is a live-in domestic worker, there are other rights that accrue to this person. The right to a sleeping area, which is reasonable enough for this person, because they are residing with you as a person. You chose that you want a person who stays with you. You the employer, you chose that you want a person who resides with you. So this person gets a right to reasonable accommodation or reasonable place where they should be able to sleep. They also now get a right to food because they are residing with you. They cannot be going wherever they came from, Rachtura, where, and say, I'm getting my own food. No, because
it's Rachtura for me, but it's okay.
I will give you an example. Okay,
absolutely.
Yes, so because they are staying with you, you have to give them food because they are residing with you. But I also want always to tell the domestic workers out there that when we say the right to food, we don't say the meat, the chicken. As long as what has been provided is eatable by a human person and agreeable, it shouldn't be that. Because I always hear some of the good complaints, oh, I'm given posho and beans and they eat the meat. But posho and beans is food. So the right to food has not been violated.
So under the law,
it's absolutely okay. So only that kind of treatment of the domestic worker may result into other negative coping mechanisms of this domestic worker. When they are preparing the meat, they may eat it so that they also get ingested. But yes, that's what happens. Then the other rights, of course, which they also have a right to rest. Someone cannot work continuously. Even the drafter of the Employment Act, so that even me and you, people even who sit in office, you can't work continuously for the entire day. You have to get a rest of at least 1 hour to rest. So even them, when they are working, when you find a person resting, allow them to rest because they are also workers, just like any other worker. They also have a right, by the way, to annual leave. And this is you plan it accordingly. And I always tell my colleagues that you can plan an annual leave for domestic workers accordingly. You can either plan it within when you get leave you yourself, and so when I get leave, you also get to go. For those who have children that are grown up, when they come back from school, maybe they get to get maybe 5 days of leave, like that. But because sometimes you assume that these are not human beings. And for me, what amuses me most is the people who abuse these rights are the people who actually get annual leave.
Exactly.
And that is very, very bad. It's very bad. Because like I said, the domestic work is the engine of your ability to be able to participate, in productivity. So because they are also workers in their own category, it's very important that even their rights are also respected. There is always a controversial right, the right to maternity leave. It's always very, very, very controversial, very controversial. But because the Employment Act is very generic in nature, it would also mean that they are also entitled to maternity leave if they give birth. That's what it would mean. And when you read into the ILO Convention number 189 on decent work for domestic workers, indeed they state that they also have a right to maternity leave if it's a female domestic worker who has given birth. And if it's a male domestic worker whose wife has given birth, they have a right to the 4 days to be able to go and be with their spouse. So it is also that particular right, just like we also have it ideally. They have a right to form association, to join labor union or form association. So sometimes you hear employers telling the domestic when they come in, I don't want you to speak to the neighbors. No, you're taking away that right or right of expression and right to associate with people. You know, only that tell the person, whereas you can associate with my neighbors, please associate yourself with them. My home should not become a topic of discussion with them, but you can associate with people. But sometimes we see employers telling the domestic workers should not talk to neighbors, what, and all those things. And that's why you find that domestic workers sometimes do weird things to their family members just because of that. They have a right not to be treated. They have a right to be treated in a humane manner within the home where they are serving, they are serving or where they are working. They have a right to be treated. You cannot be beaten, for example. Okay, and we see domestic. And one of what I didn't talk about in this domestic work sector of Uganda is that most homes they employ children as domestic workers, which is against the law because then that becomes child labor. And you know, domestic work is one of the worst forms of child labor. Why? Because it is manual and because it involves long working hours. You cannot measure for any child, you know, so it needs someone who is 18 years and above. And that is why you find that some employers end up even assaulting the domestic workers because they even make orders, bring for me a young one whom I can manage, you know, because they want to be able, but we're talking about manipulation, but we're talking about this is an occupation. And that's why, as we go into the amendment, we'll also be talking about that particular aspect. Has it been, stated clear that for avoidance of doubt, when it comes to domestic workers, a child should not be employed as a domestic worker. Because this is manual work, this is hazardous work, this is work involving long hours. The domestic workers also have a right not to be sexually harassed in the course of employment, for example. But we have seen domestic workers, and because they are domestic workers, and there is a master-servant relationship in this setting, they are always lied to. I will also make for your home and all those, given empty promises at the end of the day. So we that's why we take it is a sexual harassment because there is a higher person in it. But yet our female counterpart or all the mothers in this home, they instead look at domestic workers as people who have come to take over their homes. And yet instead of looking at it that whatever has happened to this domestic worker in this home is actually abuse, it's actually harassment, and even needs to be reported in most cases. But some domestic workers get pregnant in the course of sometimes by the fathers of the house, sometimes by the male members or children of that household. So that also happens, and those are all abuses that meted out to domestic. But they have a right to be treated in a humane manner and not to be abused in any way. One of the biggest things that they face as domestic workers is around issues of payment. In most cases, people don't want to pay domestic workers, and I wonder where people get the peace to sleep when you've not paid a domestic worker. They don't pay, and you know why? Because one, they're employing children whom they can manipulate. Two, because people just don't value that domestic work is also work which this person is doing so that they're able to feed, to look after their other people. You understand? Because in Uganda we have a very high dependence rate. Even if I earn 200,000 shillings a month, there is someone who depends on me.
Definitely.
So definitely, if you do not pay my salary, you are antagonizing that chain at the end of the day. So that is one of the other biggest challenges that we have.
Council Lydia, on that one there, you've talked about some of the rights, like, for example, the annual leave and being paid.
Yes.
We see this even in the formal employment sector not being met at times.
Yeah.
We know of companies that haven't paid workers for a long time, and they have given excuses and gone by. They have been able to bypass the law. But is there any legal action that can be taken against some of the employers that are not following the law? Are there some strict rules and regulations that have been put in place and jail sentences that have actually been realized in the recent past on some of the employers that are not compliant?
The law is there. The Employment Act is there. When you fail to pay your worker, it's one of the grounds that the labor officer can actually use to terminate that contract. But at the end of the day, you have to still pay the wages that you have not paid. When we look at the employer-employee relationship, it's a civil matter. So it will not attract criminal jail sentence per se, because it's an employer-employee. It's a civil matter of like, you've worked, you've not paid, or unfair. So the law has put in place, if, for example, you've not paid my wages, what happens? Where do I report? Where people go to report to labor offices, and then other people come to platform for labor action for legal representation in the labor offices. Well, if the labor office has not handled the case, it is escalated to the Industrial Court of Uganda, and in industrial courts, if you're not contented, you can go to the Court of Appeal. But these are cases where, if you're given a judgment, you can either attach, the employer's properties and all that. And I also want to tell you that we have also prosecuted cases of domestic workers in the labor office, but also in the industrial court. We have prosecuted them. We have represented them there, and people have been made to pay. We have even handled cases of workers' compensation for domestic workers. The minister was burnt by gas on her second day of work, and the employer had to meet the medical bills and also to compensate this person. So it is very possible for one to get redress once their rights are abused. It's only that people sometimes do not know where to report. And in most cases, what happens is that domestic workers are migrant workers within the country. For example, they come from my village, Kamuli,
and it appears that they've crossed the border.
Yeah, so they come from those, and from up country districts, and they come to the to the cities, the different cities. So they're sort of like migrants. So the only reason they're in Kampala, for example, they could be because they came to work in my household. So when the relationship severs, we separate. Most likely they just run back their home instead of they don't follow up with their rights for them to get justice. But yes, there are redresses, there are mechanisms for one to get justice, and you can report. For a domestic worker, you can start by reporting at the LC1 chairperson, because you see, these are the first courts of instance, within the community, because this person is working within the community, and the chairperson is the nearest person. And also the chairperson knows this employer, because this employer also stays in the community. So the level of engagement becomes very easy. So you can start from there. If you're not helped, you can always come to PLA or go to the labor office of that district or that division, if it's Kampala, or if it is Wakiso, or if it's a municipality. There are always labor officers at the district level, at division level, and municipality level for you to be able to be assisted. Even for other workers, by the way, that's the same procedure that we have.
Domestic work, basically, now when you talked about migrants, it brought something, of course, in mind, the fact that the government of Uganda is suspending, probably temporarily, the exportation of labor from Uganda, I think effective 23rd December. But some of these laws here, if they were carried to those countries, would save so many lives of Ugandans. We've seen so many people come out tortured. I don't know if you have cases, for example, in your organization where people have approached you and have been, of course, tortured abroad doing domestic work. How can we protect? Are there ways that now we can protect? Of course, this has been going on for a long time now in Uganda. Thousands of people have traveled to the Middle East. But have we already created some kind of regulations that are protecting domestic workers also that are working abroad?
Thank you. First of all, as PLA, we get those cases and we work on them. But most of the cases that we get are around non-payment of wages, accidents, failure to provide medication, workers' compensation. Those are some of the cases that we handle. And when they come, normally we are able to work with the Ministry of Gender to be able to handle them, and we conclude them with the company here that recruited. We have not had a chance to be able to prosecute directly the employer, the other side, but normally the companies that recruited and deployed are the companies that we deal with, because in the regulations of 2021, on migrant workers, migrant workers is it says that any liability arising out of the use of the license by this company, they are held liable. So that's where we go and we hold them liable for those cases that come up. But would these laws, if our laws, let me first answer that aspect. If our law, the Current Employment Act, if it was carried to Saudi Arabia, would the domestic workers be protected? My answer is no. They wouldn't. They wouldn't be protected. You know, when it comes to the migrant workers, I know this is a big topic that we just, here and here. It is a big concept of, and other countries, how have they done it? The countries like the Philippines, how have they done it? Because they are earning a lot of foreign exchange from externalization of labor to other countries. But what have they done that perhaps as a country we too need to do is to ensure that the monitoring systems and support systems for the migrant workers in the countries of destinations are strengthened on our side as a government. You don't leave it in the hands of the private sector to say, private sector, continue monitoring the working conditions of the people whom you've deployed. No, because these are citizens of the country. You don't hand over responsibility of protecting citizens of the country to a private entity. They remain, the government remains the primary duty bearer. And the biggest challenge that we are having is at that particular point in time, where there's, in terms of offering protection, we don't have people whom we call labor attaches in the countries of destination. Let me give you an example. A country like Saudi Arabia, which we've been having the BLA that is being suspended right now, before Congo was added onto the East Africa, Saudi Arabia, in terms of square kilometers, was bigger than the whole of East Africa. That is Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, and I think South Sudan added. So it was bigger. That is the country. That's one country. Now, in that country, there are different states. And Ugandans end up in different states, but we only have one embassy located where? Riyadh. And that embassy is ill-equipped. It does not have labor attaches. So when people have disputes in the course of employment, they have nowhere. They have no redress. So they call back the company this side. And I think that is a missing link at the end of the day. So the lack of the monitoring systems, we need a robust and comprehensive monitoring system in all the 4 stages of labor migration, ideally. Right before the pre-migration, the recruitment, the arrival stage and return stage. We need a robust monitoring system. But talking about the suspension of the BLA by the government of Uganda, I think it's suspension because we knew that it was expiring on 27th of December. The BLA was expiring that time. But from my understanding and from the different meetings that this have been part of is that as a government, the government has raised the need to amend certain provisions of the BLA to the counterpart, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the government of Saudi Arabia. And this is yet to be responded to. And, when you've had an understanding for over 5 years, this is an agreement. We have learned as a country, and those learnings need to be incorporated as we go on. Because ideally, there's also a provision that if at the end of the period, none of the party has indicated that it should be terminated, then it will automatically renew. But here the government is saying, let us amend. So also there's a provision for an amendment. Yeah, so we are just waiting on that. And I'm sure, I think at a bilateral level, it will be able to be sorted out because people have sunk in money in these businesses. And by the way, the business of externalization of labor is big, very big. We look normally at the recruitment companies, but we also have training centers that have been accredited. Now there are over 50 that are active now, because 2 of them have been revoked, but 50 are active. So this is money we're talking about. People have invested billions of shillings in this particular business, and therefore we understand, and I know that bilaterally there will be an understanding, because also we fear, once you suspend legal procedures of people to go and work abroad, what will happen is that there will be an increase in trafficking of Ugandans for labor. There will be traffic, like we saw in 2016 when the first bilateral agreement with the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was suspended. There was a lot of people, Ugandans, that were trafficked out of this country, and they ended up in 2 conditions indicative of human trafficking and modern day slavery. So once it is a danger to cancel the legal channel, because then they will use the illegal channel. Why? Because labor migration is a fact of life, actually. We like it or not, people migrate for work. So it's a fact of life. So when it's a fact of life, you have to respond to that fact of life, ensuring that you are addressing the challenges. So I think what the government is trying is to, the challenges that they have learned and experienced in the 5 years of the BLA, they want to see that they are addressed as we move forward. Yes.
We have some feedback here on Twitter. And of course, before we get into the break and getting into the amendments in this bill, Dr. Clark Chisembo, who is watching the show, thank you very much, Dr. Clark, has something here. He says, I'm watching and very insightful. I wish to say that in Rwanda, actually, the majority of domestic workers are male, especially in coupled homes. Could social cultural norms also be a contribution to the trends, stereotypes, and prejudices? By the way, what about Shamba Boys?
Thank you, Doctor. I think, yes, of course, like I said, the domestic work sector in Uganda is there are social cultural biases that have been, because they are formed around the gender, the gender roles. So the woman, you're the one who is supposed to do that work. So when you get a domestic worker, they have come to help you. So even as the women, we intend to employ fellow women, because we also have that understand that it is women who are supposed to do this kind of work. So yeah, it is very true that the social cultural stereotypes that are around the domestic work sector, they are ingrained within the traditions that we have grown up with society, how it has carved out the roles of men and women, and it's very interesting and very annoying that even in educational institutions, people even study about those roles. I saw my child when we were in baby class, I think, was given homework, and that homework had roles, like they had put the roles of father, mother, and then you had to match. So when she matched that the father can cook, because for her she has seen the father cooking, the teacher marked it wrong. And I had to go and engage the teacher and say, who tells you that the father does not cook? And said, no, this is a syllabus. So I couldn't also argue so much. But you can imagine, so I agree with you, Doctor, that some of the things around the domestic work is the cultural stereotypes and the formation of gender roles that has held it in that form. But talk about Shamba Boys. Yes, Shamba Boys are also partaken, they form part of the domestic workers, because like when I was defining the domestic work, I said domestic work is work that is done in and around the household for remuneration, by the way, for pay, So the household, the garden is an extension of the household. And in most cases, what happens that in these domestic workers is that normally the Shamba Boys also double as gate men or gate man, something of that sort. No wonder they end up earning more than other domestic workers in the same household that are only doing the household chores and all that. But yes, they are part and parcel of the domestic work.
And I think the job can also be part-time. Like you mentioned, the fact that it doesn't have to be someone who lives in the home.
No.
Could be someone, I know people who wash clothes on different households. Those are also domestic workers.
Yes, they come and wash and go. In fact, they even have routine, like they can come and say, I wash for this person 3 days in a week. So they go and wash, and they are paid and they go away. So because they're temporary, because there's permanent and temporary, live in and live out. So all those are domestic workers.
All right, we are going to take another quick breather, Miss Witten. When we return, we've heard a lot about the domestic workers and how they should be preserved, their rights. We want to talk now about the amendments that this bill is bringing on board.
Yes.
But also, I want to hear your side of the employer. the employer has been left in the space because just a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken, 3 or 4 years ago, there was a video circulating of a maid who was almost strangling a baby. And I've seen several others where these people, the domestic workers we are trying to protect, are actually sabotaging that protection and trying to actually bring harm to their employers or the children of their employers. So does the law also, in the amendments, have you thought about the employer himself, protecting the employer? And then as well, companies have come up. I know of 2 of them, about the Proud Uganda Maids Association, the Domestic Workers Association, several others that are uniting these domestic workers. But have we put in place a licensing criteria, an authentic one where we can have all these actually dealt with and licensed under the law? Anthony is my name, and we are talking domestic work with Miss Lydia Buite, who is a programs officer at the Platform for Labor Action. Hit us up on Twitter at Smart24TV. We want to hear from you definitely on the subject, and don't go anywhere. Stay with us. We drive your business.